Hello, my name is Carlos Garcia, and today we are going to have a conversation with high school students about science. Science is a wonderful discipline that explains how the world works. In high school, one takes many courses, languages, history, mathematics, physics, what have you. Some of those courses, of course, are part of the study of science. But unfortunately, there is not enough time to get into sufficient depth to pursue a given field. So what we will do here is try to create a conceptual map that shows the most important branches of science. We will talk about what are the topics that are covered in each one of those branches. We will look at some of the current activities that the scientific community performs in those fields. And we will also talk about sources of information and how one can pursue science not as an assignment but as a fun activity. Because the thing is that science is a fascinating discipline. It is better than movies, better than entertainment. With science, you can have a lot of fun understanding how things work. So, well, let's get started with this activity. Let's look at the elements of a broad education. First of all, what is literacy? By literacy, we understand the ability to function with an acceptable level of knowledge in a given topic. So we have human literacy that refers to topics like literature, history, philosophy, the arts, music, painting, languages. So all these subfields constitute what makes part of the human literacy. There is another type of literacy, which is the one that deals with digital and technology systems, and the topics that it includes are things like digital systems, understanding what digital systems are all about, software design, knowing what is software, how it is designed in very general terms. You don't have to be an expert in software design in order to have literacy in the topic, but you need to understand what is software, what it does, and how it is designed. It is also important to understand telecommunications because we live in a world that is intercommunicated. And finally, a topic that is of great relevance right now is artificial intelligence. So these subtopics make what is understood as digital and technology literacy. These two areas of human literacy and digital and technology literacy will be covered in future videos. This particular video addresses science literacy. Science is a tool that helps us understand how things work. And what are the things that we have in front of us? Well, fundamentally, the universe. All the planets, the galaxies, everything that is in outer space, that is the universe. And then, in particular, within that universe is the planet Earth, which is our home, is where we live. So we use science to try to understand the inner details of the workings of the universe as well as of the planet Earth. Okay, we're now ready to start our exploration of the domains of science. Our first stop is the universe. What a wonderful thing. The universe is everything that exists today, everything that has ever existed. And science has come a long way in terms of understanding the universe. Remember that a few centuries back in the Middle Ages, people thought that the Earth was the center of the universe and that all the stars rotated around the Earth. Well, we have come a long way since then, and we now have a deep understanding of the universe. Of course, there are many things we don't yet know about the universe, but what we already know is a lot, and it is a fascinating story. So, without further ado, let's get going with our exploration. The universe started 13.8 billion years ago. At that time, the universe was a minute thing the size of the head of a pin. And then there was a big explosion, that is what is called the Big Bang. And that was the beginning of the universe. It exploded and it kept expanding and expanding, and many things happened during that expansion to get to the point where we are today, 13.8 billion years later. Let's take a look at the beginning. In the first 3 minutes after the Big Bang, there were some minute particles called quarks. And these quarks come in two types. One that is called up quarks and the other one is called down quark. Those quarks can get together. So if you have two up quarks and one down quark that get together, they form a particle that is called a proton. And if two down quarks and one up quark get together, they form a particle called the neutron. Now, proton and neutrons can get together and they form what is called a nucleus. That nucleus will later be used to create the first atoms. As we have seen, it took 3 minutes to form the nucleus, the first nucleus. But then to make an atom, you need to have a nucleus and it needs to be surrounded by electrons. Well, it took 300,000 years for the first atoms to appear. So that is the very beginning of the universe. We start with the quarks in the first 3 minutes, then they get together to form a nucleus, and then it takes 300,000 years to form the first atoms. Now let's take a look at how this universe at the very beginning is studied and analyzed. There are some tools that are fundamental for the study of the universe. One of them is physics. And within physics, there are several branches that are very important. One is called classical mechanics. Then there is particle physics. Then there is quantum mechanics. And then there is relativity theory. Now, you also need mathematics in order to make the analysis that is required of these particles. And among the branches of mathematics that are used is calculus, is differential equations, and is matrix analysis. What we call classical mechanics is really an application of physics to see how bodies relate to one another. For example, in classical mechanics, we study how the planets rotate around the sun, and what are the relationships, what are the laws that are applied to regulate that movement of the planets. Another area of classical mechanics is looking at springs. You need a force to stretch a spring, and if you let it go, the spring compresses and releases that force. So there are equations that describe the motion of a spring. If you are pulling a weight on an inclined plane, you need to exert a force to slide that weight up the inclined plane. That is also something that is analyzed by classical mechanics. Also, there are some relations of electricity that you can study there. If you have a bouncing ball and a ball comes and hits another one that is at rest, and that second ball that was at rest, once it is hit, it starts moving. How the motion of those balls is related is part of classical mechanics. Another important tool in the analysis of particles in the universe is quantum physics. Quantum physics looks at the relationships among those elementary particles. And there is something that is very interesting, and is that elementary particles do not behave like the bodies that we see in classical mechanics. Let's say, when a ball comes and hits another ball and the second one starts moving, that is part of classical mechanics. In quantum physics, when there are collisions among particles and things like that, the reactions are different. So there are certain laws that we are not familiar with and that we need to understand in order to be able to work with elementary particles. One of those effects in quantum physics is what is called quantum tunneling. Suppose that we have an experiment like the following. You are kicking a ball against a wall. When the ball hits the wall, it bounces back towards you. That is something that happens in classical mechanics. However, in quantum physics, there is a phenomenon where a particle can hit what apparently is a barrier, and that particle is able to go across that barrier, and that is a phenomenon that is called quantum tunneling, because it is like if the particle were able to create a tunnel that allows it to go across a barrier. Quantum tunneling is a very important effect in quantum physics. Another effect that is very interesting is what is called wave-particle duality. As you probably know, particles have a mass, and they are like little round balls that exist in space. And then there is radiation like light, and light moves in the form of waves. So in classical mechanics, we know that there are bodies and that there are waves, and they are completely separate and different. Well, in quantum physics, there is a phenomenon which is called the wave-particle duality, where a particle behaves like a wave. And there is a classical experiment, which is the one that is called the double slit experiment, where you have a plate that has two slits in there. And of course, if you were to hit it with a wave of light, then on the other side of the screen, you would see what is called an interference pattern, which is typical of waves. Now, the thing that is very surprising is that if you shoot electronic particles, like electrons, for example, through the double slit, you get on the other side an interference pattern that is characteristic of waves. What that means is that the particle is behaving like a wave. So one of the fundamentals of quantum physics is this duality, where particles sometimes behave like bodies and other times behave like waves. There is one more principle in quantum physics, which is the principle of superposition. And what this principle says is that there are two things, two behaviors that are opposite and can take place at the same time. In other words, a particle can be in one place and in another place at the same time. That is a superposition. And there is a famous experiment. This is is not a real physical experiment, but it's the idea of an experiment that was postulated by scientists called Schrödinger, which is called the cat experiment. And it works the following way. Suppose that you have a cardboard box and you put inside a cat. Now there is a container in there that has cyanide, and if that container is open, the cyanide will come out and the cat will be suffocated and dies. And there is a trigger that if an atomic particle comes in and hits this trigger, then a hammer breaks the container of the cyanide and the cat dies. Now, when the box is closed, the cat can be dead or can be alive. But according to the superposition principle, the cat is not that is either dead or alive, but the cat is both dead and alive at the same time. And it is only if we open the cover of the box and look inside, then the superposition principle says that one of the two possibilities becomes a reality. And you will find that the cat is either dead or alive. But it's not that the cat, let's say, died when you opened the box. It's that the cat was both dead and alive at the same time. And once you looked at it, the superposition principle led to one possibility only. So evidently, quantum physics is something that is not intuitive, is not easy to understand, but at the same time, it is the basic technique that is used to analyze the particles that form the different bodies in the universe. There is very interesting research that is performed in different laboratories around the world to understand these elementary particles and to be able to know how the universe works. There is a special research installation in Europe that is called the Hadron Collider. And the Hadron Collider is a circular tunnel that has 5 miles in diameter. And inside that tunnel, there is a metal tube that goes around, and it is full of instrumentation. And what is done is through the use of special electromagnets. Particles are accelerated around this tube and they are led to perform collisions. And the result of those collisions are analyzed by scientists. And actually, what is being done is replicating phenomena that take place in outer space. And by using this collider, then these scientists are able to understand what is going on in outer space. This is a view of the Hadron Collider inside. This is the tunnel that goes around that has a diameter of 5 miles. And as you can see, there is this tube, circular tube, that is full of electronic devices and instrumentation. And through there is that these particles travel at very high speeds, and that is where the collisions take place. Albert Einstein is one of the most famous scientists in the history of man, and he formulated at the beginning of the 20th century what is called the theory of relativity. And that theory has been fundamental in order to understand how the universe works and how matter in the universe behaves. What Einstein said is that energy and matter are related and they can be converted one to the other. In other words, if you have a source of energy, that energy can be turned into matter. And likewise, if you have a body of matter, that body can be transformed into energy. And there is the famous equation that says E equal to mc squared, where E is energy, m is mass, and c is the speed of light. And what this equation tells us is that for a given mass m, if you multiply that by the square of the speed of light, then you get the amount of energy produced by that amount of matter. Another aspect of the relativity theory is that Einstein postulated the fact that in outer space, space is not straight. It can be a curve depending on the gravity. For example, if we have the sun and there is a star in a remote location, that star sends a ray of light in the direction of Earth. Well, when that light gets to the proximity of the sun, the space around the sun is curved, and it makes the light to take a curve and arrive on Earth. So when we see that light, we tend to think in terms of straight lines. So we say, oh, so that star is up in front of us, a straight line, and that is what is called the apparent location of the star, because that's where it appears to be, but it is not there. The actual location is behind the sun. But because of the curvature of the space, we get a false vision in terms of the location of the star. So that is what the curvature of space is in the relativity theory of Albert Einstein. Well, as we saw before, at the beginning, the universe was very, very small. It was a minute dimension, and it has been expanding since the Big Bang. Now, how do we know that? How did scientists come to the conclusion that the universe is expanding? Well, there is a phenomenon known as the Doppler effect that we are familiar with. We may not know it by its name, but we are familiar with. Suppose that an ambulance is going and the siren is going full blast. If the ambulance is getting away from one person, as we see here, the person on the left, then the frequency of the sound is low. So this person hears the siren as a low frequency sound. But a person who is on the other side, where the ambulance is going, that person is getting the sound as a high frequency. So these two people hear the sound of the ambulance in a different way, because in one case the waves of the sound are being expanded and they are perceived as a low frequency, and on the other side the waves of the sound are being compressed and that turns them into a high frequency. So that's what the Doppler effect says in terms of sound. It turns out that the Doppler effect also works for light waves. And let's look at this illustration that is on the right side of the image. Suppose that we have two planets that are remote and that are rotating around a center in there. The figure shows that the planet on the left is moving in a direction that goes towards the observer, and the planet of the right is moving in a direction that goes away from the observer. Then what happens is that the light emitted by the planet that is approaching the observer gets compressed, while the light of the planet that is moving away from the observer, that light gets expanded and it moves. If you look at the frequencies of light rays, the high frequency is in the blue and violet side, and the low frequency is in the red and infrared. So when you look at the light coming from a remote planet, and if that light is towards the red side, you know that that planet is moving away from us. If the light is more towards the blue and the violet, that means that that planet is moving towards us. Using high power telescopes like the Webb telescope that was put into space recently in 2022, we can get very accurate images from remote galaxies and stars, and the images from those heavenly bodies can be analyzed. That way, it has been determined that most galaxies are moving away from us, meaning that the universe is expanding. Not only is it expanding, but scientists have been able to measure the speed at which the universe is expanding. Well, there is an interesting situation is if we know how fast the universe is expanding, then if you look in the opposite direction, you can calculate how smaller it was in the past. And when you take that calculation all the way back, that's how you determine that the universe has existed for 13.8 billion years. So that's how scientists have been able to calculate what was the moment in the past when the Big Bang took place. The exploration of space is not just done by looking through telescopes, but actually mankind has been able to fly into space and that way be able to explore better what is in space. And as you will know, we have already been to the moon with astronauts, and we have been to Mars, not with astronauts, but with spaceships and robots that are exploring that planet. And there is a very active research going on in terms of exploration of space through flight. The technique that is used to do all those calculations of how to get a rocket into orbit, to calculate the orbits, to know what the trajectory should be to go to another planet like Mars and so forth, all of that technique is what is called rocket science. And you probably have heard the term used when something is very complicated. People say, oh, that is very complicated. That is like rocket science. Because indeed, rocket science is complex. It uses advanced physics. It uses the theory of relativity. It uses essentially all of the tools that we have at the moment. But rocket science is a beautiful, beautiful branch of science in it, and it is something that is worth learning about and exploring. Of course, if you like it very much, you can actually have a career in that field. But even if you decide not to do a career in rocket science, just knowing about it is something really fascinating. Now that we have had the opportunity of looking at the universe, our next stop is our planet Earth. The Earth is very, very small. It's almost infinitesimal in size compared to the universe. But it is our home. It is where we live, and therefore is worth learning about it. The story of the Earth, as you will see, is also fascinating. And well, let's take a look. Let's see what happened to the Earth from the beginning and how has it evolved until reaching the point where we are today. It is, as you will see, also a fascinating story. The Earth is much younger than the universe. It is only 4.4 billion years old. Earth started as an incandescent ball that began cooling off. When it was beginning that process of cooling, it was hit by a celestial body. There was a big explosion, and out of that came the moon. But the Earth survived that collision, and it continued in its development. Once the Earth cooled off sufficiently, there was a crust that was formed, and that was an initial continent. It has been called Pangaea, and around it there was a single ocean. So at the very beginning, the Earth consisted of a single continent, Pangaea, and a single ocean. Then that continent began to break into pieces, and those pieces are what we now know as tectonic plates. The tectonic plates continue to move. They have separated into pieces, and we can see here today that's where we are. We have the continents that have moved away from one another, and the plates are still there, and those plates continue to move, and the continents where we live are actually moving very slowly, but they are moving anyway. As the Earth continued to cool off, and there was plenty of water, and the temperatures in the continents were lower, that made life possible. And so we can see how in this timetable, some 4 billion years ago, there was enough water out there that condensed, and some 3.9 billion years back, the first molecules of proteins that later were part of the DNA began to form, and about 3.6 billion years we had in the Earth all the components necessary to create the DNA. Once DNA formed, that was the beginning of life on Earth. There had been a very slow but consistent progress over time. Initially, there were small bacteria that formed. After that, fungi appeared. Later on, corals, and about 500 million years ago, fish appeared. Some 300 million years ago, the dinosaurs appeared. 100 million years ago, mammals began to appear on the Earth. 60 million years ago, the Earth saw primates that appear in there. And then finally, some 5 million years ago, the first ancestors of man appeared on Earth. And then finally, we got to the point where Homo sapiens appeared, and that's where we are today. Charles Darwin is a very famous scientist who proposed what is called the theory of evolution. And this theory attempts to explain how life forms change over time, and we move from one species to another and to another, all the way down until we get to man. Darwin talked about 4 phases of evolution. One is overproduction, where there are a lot of members of one species that exist at a given moment. Then there is variation, meaning that not all of them are identical. There are differences among those. And then there is adaptation. And what that means is that some of those differences may be advantageous. That those differences in some cases can make life easier. So those members of the species that have these advantages are the ones who prevail. Their children inherit those characteristics, and then through the process of selection, you begin to see new forms of life. That is what evolution is all about. One thing is evolution, which is how species evolve over millions of years, and how one species changes and gives rise to a new species. So that's evolution. But there is another aspect of this that is very important, which is what is called development, and is the lifespan of one individual in the species. Take one animal, and what happens to that animal from the moment when it starts as a single cell, and then that cell keeps dividing and dividing until you have a full animal. Well, through the study of development, we now know that animals are formed through building blocks, that there is some kind of modular architecture. There are modules that come together, and assembling is like assembling a Lego kit. That's how an individual comes into being. Let's look at the example of a fly. The fate map of a fly that we see in this picture is a diagram that shows how the animal is formed. And you'll see that there are elements like the head, the eyes, the wing, the legs that form in different parts of the animal. Now, how does that happen? Well, that happens through the genes. The cells have the DNA, which is like the map or the plan of how the animal is to be built. And then all the cells contain genes. The genes are specialized. Each gene knows how to do something. They are there, but they do not do anything until they are activated. So, for example, when it comes the time to produce the eye in an individual, the gene that knows how to produce eyes is activated, and then the eye develops. The same thing will happen to the gene that knows how to make wings, and the gene who knows how to make legs, the gene that knows how to make the nervous system, and so forth. So it is through the interplay of the genes that the animal comes together. There are two fundamental tools that are used to study evolution and development. The main one is biology. Biology is the study of living things, and it looks at cell theory and evolution and adaptations and regulation and how the various parts of a body work and so forth. But the processes that take place inside the cells, those are fundamentally chemical processes. Therefore, chemistry is very important as a tool to understand the biological processes that take place in the formation of the living beings. If we now look at the evolution of man, our history is fairly recent in terms of the history of the planet. Our earliest ancestors appeared 5 million years ago, and there were several branches that tree followed. One of those branches was the chimpanzees that continued throughout the 5 million years, and today we have chimpanzees that are very much similar to what they were millions of years ago. In the case of man, our tree has taken many branches. We have different kinds of ancestors. We have some recent ancestors like Homo erectus and Homo habilis. And finally, the last step in our development is Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is fairly new on Earth. It is estimated that Homo sapiens has been around for maybe some 300,000 years or so. Now, that Homo sapiens is not exactly like we are today. Physically, they look like us, but there is an important difference, and is that they did not have a language. The language ability only appeared 70,000 years ago. That is almost like yesterday. It is a very, very short time ago. But the appearance of language is what gave man the intellectual ability that we all have today. And that is what made possible the development of civilization. Man is biologically very sophisticated, and the most complex organ that we have is the human brain. The human brain is an organ that has many parts within it, and each one of those parts has a specific function, from vision, from audition, from smelling, from language, from reasoning, from motion, equilibrium, and so forth. Plus, in addition to all of that, the brain controls the function of the body. It is the brain that controls the lungs, that controls the heart, that makes the heart beat, and all of that. So the human brain is a very complex, and it is an absolute marvel. The brain is made out of cells that are called neurons. And neurons are fairly different from the rest of the cells that we have in the body. The main characteristic of neurons is that the signals that they transmit are electrical signals. That is why they say that the brain is like a computer, in the sense that it is using electricity to send all its signals, and all the processing is done via electricity. And as we can see in this diagram, a neuron has a central part and then has an extension, a fairly long extension, which is called the axon, and that axon has some terminals that connect to other neurons. And this is how you make networks of neurons that are interconnected and that they communicate one to the other through these electrical signals. If we look at some of the numbers related to the brain, they are amazing. For example, the human brain has 86 billion neurons. Now, all the interconnections, remember that each neuron has many little branches that are the ones that interconnect to other neurons. Those are called the synapses. Well, in the brain, there is a total of 10 trillion synapses. That is mind-boggling. It's absolutely unbelievable. If you were to string all the branches of neurons one after the other, they will reach 100,000 miles. So this gives us an idea of the sophistication and the complexity of the human brain. Here we can see some of the functions of the human brain, and I mean some because it has many, many more. But it can do things like face recognition. The brain is programmed to automatically recognize faces, numbers, the motor commands, how to move the legs, how to move the arms, and so forth, to process sounds, to process vision, to do error detection, and things like that. There are many, many functions that the brain has. The most sophisticated function of the brain is what is called consciousness. Consciousness is hard to define, but it is understood as the ability to know that you are yourself. It is through consciousness that we can look at ourselves and say, I am thinking. I am angry. I am happy. So you have the ability to look at yourself like if you were looking from the outside. That's part of what consciousness is all about. An interesting thing is that consciousness operates only when you're awake. When you're asleep, consciousness kind of goes away and the brain is resting but is not processing information. Also, when you're being operated and you are given anesthesia, then anesthesia has the ability to temporarily suspend consciousness. That is why doctors can cut your skin and get inside and you don't feel any pain or anything like that, because your consciousness has been suspended through the anesthesia. So one of the great challenges that science has right now is to explain how consciousness works from those electronic signals that are in the brain. How do you combine those signals to produce consciousness? Well, neuroscience is that branch of science that studies the brain and the nervous system. And it is a very sophisticated, very elegant branch of science, and it is something that is absolutely worth knowing about. You don't have to become a neuroscientist, but a person who is interested in science should spend some time trying to understand what neuroscience is all about, what it covers, where are we today in terms of research in neuroscience, and where we are going. So this brings us to sort of the end of all those marvelous things that are on planet Earth that science is trying to study and to understand. Well, we are now at the end of our trip through the various regions of science. I hope that you have found this trip motivational. As you can see, there are many, many fields that are all fascinating. Each one of them can become a lifelong career if so you choose. But also, even if you decide not to pursue science as a career, it can be a lot of fun as a hobby to just enjoy seeing how things work around the world. It is great, it is fascinating, and I hope that you will take the time to explore many of the things that we have discussed in these videos. Thank you very much and good luck.